Next week, U.S. President Joe Biden will host leaders from across the African continent in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. Now, the Americans say that this summit will demonstrate the United States' enduring commitment to Africa and will underscore the importance of U.S.-Africa relations and increase cooperation on shared global priorities. Now, over the years, we've seen other summits with similar messages from China, France and Russia. Does this mark a new scramble for Africa? And if so, what are the implications for the continent? Well, someone who's been grappling with that very question today is the director for the Center of Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, Professor David Monyae. He joins us now. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, Prof. This sounds like a huge question. We've sort of touched on it before over time. And I just wonder, from the gathering and the dialogue that you had today, is there a new scramble for Africa?
I think we have seen an increased activities by external forces, external powers in this case, that have huge interests on the African continent. What brings all these powers to Africa is that Africa has 1.3 billion people, and it is the youngest in terms of age, and is the future market, and everyone everywhere is looking into this future market and ensure that they're quite close to bring in their products, and as well as the minerals that we have and a number of other opportunities in terms of investment that the continent provides. However, this competition has both positive as well as negative. At the end of the day, I think the biggest question that we asked in the seminar today is that what exactly does Africa want from the external players?
All right. Well, you've sort of given us a hint about what they want. Tell us how they're doing it. How are they coming through? Because we see some countries building parliaments, building stadiums, and giving all kinds of gifts. Is this to open the door, create a relationship, or is this outright bribery?
It really depends. With, each case has its own, there's a way of looking at each and every case. But in most cases, I think we see a genuine move by these powers to have a constructive relationship with Africa. But in other areas, particularly in the security sector, there are major concerns. I think we have seen with endless coups in West Africa, and some of those forces were trained by the very same strategic partners. We have mercenaries that are hovering around the continent. And at times the AU has no control in terms of military bases that are being established by these powers. The AU has a clear position, no foreign forces on the African continent, but nonetheless, they do indeed violate the sovereignty of the continent. And it takes us back to 2011 with the Libya war. We had the president of South Africa had to ask for permission to enter African airspace from NATO. A number of activities that took place in that war, we still suffer from the consequence of the destruction of Muammar Gaddafi as well as the state of Libya in 2011.
All right. You mentioned that we need to decide what we want, but before we get there, what are the implications of this new scramble for Africa? We know what's been happening in the past, and you've mentioned some examples there. But in the modern era, what are some of the consequences that might flow, or implications that might flow from this inward movement from these outside forces?
I think the most important thing is for the AU to have a policy towards external powers that are active on the continent. And we always ask simple question. If the AU receives 20 calls, which call they pick up first and why? We have to see which power brings what. Do we really need all of them? or we have to be very selective. In what areas do we need assistance from outside powers? At times, we tend to get help where we really do not need help, particularly in peacekeeping. The bulk of peacekeeping activities is funded by external forces. And there's no continent that can rely on external forces to fund its own peacekeeping. When it comes to the new trade agreement that has been signed, I mean, we see some movements where we get assistance from the very same people we're going to trade with. And I think there's a lack of thinking on our part as Africans that we need to ring-fence certain areas where there's no-go area for external role players, and others we work jointly with them. But what is more important is that we need to get skills, the capacity to do this building of infrastructure in future. We cannot have China or any other power building our infrastructure 20 years from now.
The Ukraine conflict has shown us sometimes to get stuck in the middle. And much like during the Cold War, it was East versus West. And I just wonder, with this new scramble, are we going to get caught in the middle again?
We are already. I think we hear blames coming from all sides. However, I think for South Africa and some African countries, their position is quite clear that we do not want to take sides. We do not support violence that is going on in Ukraine. However, we strongly believe in a peaceful way of resolving the conflict without really throwing in weapons by both sides. And therefore, to resolve the crisis in Ukraine, I think we need to really think deeper in terms of strengthening multilateral institutions to play a critical role, and as well as to think about other conflicts, that it's not only Ukraine. You just focus on the Great Lake region, the DRC, M23 causing havoc. We have crises in Ethiopia, in Libya, and most of North Africa, in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and a number of other areas. And therefore, I think the international community need to pay attention to all these conflicts equally and ensure that we support the advancement of human rights.
What do you say or think when you reflect on the actions of some of our governments? Because we found ourselves holding large debtors' books to some of these new big countries, these that are scrambling for our resources. Are we mortgaging our countries off that then paralyzes us in terms of our independence?
I think we have to think quite seriously. And I think what is critical in the post-COVID-19 is to really think. We mentioned a case in which quite a number of Western powers that advise us to buy body bags. And some of our governments went on to dig graves instead of building hospitals and strengthening our health infrastructure. And therefore, I think we cannot only blame external role players. We have to think as Africans, ensure that we prioritize our people, we think about core issues, particularly energy, that we face a crisis, and deal with these issues without interference by external role players.
I just wonder, some countries are under pressure in terms of things like human rights records and so on and so forth. And I just wonder if sometimes we get pulled into these conversations inadvertently, and then we end up being quiet when there is obvious wrongdoing at times.
Human rights is an important issue. And as we all know, we suffered from a colonial rule and slavery and quite a number of other ways of violation of human rights by Western powers. And therefore, it is important that we do raise our voice where human rights is being abused. But having said that, we also have to be careful that human rights issues and democracy is not weaponized. And therefore, we need to speak within multilateral structures and raise a strong voice against the governments that are violating human rights, regardless of whether they are our partners or not. But this has to be done even-handedly. We cannot advance or fight powers that are violating human rights in one part of the world, and we look the other side, where on a daily basis, human rights of people are being violated.
All right, so what are the big steps that Africa needs to take now going forward?
The continent needs unity. We need to fight corruption. We need to be clear in terms of what we want as Africans and direct all external role players, investments in areas that advance integration, advance Africa's unity. And when it comes to issues of weapons being spread on the continent, we need to find mechanisms of ensuring that we silence the guns. But as it stands, I think we have a serious problem on our hands.
China is a country you know well, and their involvement with the continent is decades. First in the liberation struggles, the freedoms across the continent, and in more recent times, it's more political and economic. And I just wonder how we manage this relationship, because there are times when we look at things like Taiwan, where Dalai Lama tries to come to South Africa, that we are forced into difficult decisions that don't quite make sense for citizens.
I think the situation is quite clear for all countries, including the United States, agrees to one China policy, and therefore most African countries other than Swaziland do not look at one China policy, and therefore the bulk of the continent adheres to one China, and therefore the issue of Taiwan, it's really a non-starter. We want to see a united China that includes the territory of Taiwan under Beijing, as well as Hong Kong, Macau. We experience more or less same colonial history, and we understand these things quite well. And having said that, our relationship with China is growing. We have areas where we differ with China. However, after every 3 years, we do get together under China-Africa cooperation to discuss these issues and iron our differences and move forward without having this mega diplomacy of shouting at Beijing.
All right. Professor David Monyae, always good talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for unpacking this scramble for Africa, this new version, and how Africa needs to position itself for this new age. Thanks for your time.
Most welcome.
All right, that's Professor David Monyae speaking to us about a discussion that they had earlier today. A new scramble for Africa, what are the implications for the continent? Well, these superpowers are coming into the continent because we are ripe and ready in terms of our populations, our economies, and just being the sort of, I suppose, the continent with the greatest potential. But we have to be careful, I think, was the message coming from the Prof.